Sometimes a moment on television stops being entertainment and turns into something unforgettable. You know the kind I'm talking about. The kind that feels less like a talk show and more like a reckoning. A moment when someone finally says what so many others have been thinking, but never had the nerve or the standing to say out loud. That's exactly what happened the night Clint Eastwood walked onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage. Now, maybe you've seen clips, maybe you heard whispers online, but I'm going to walk you through what really happened that night and why it struck such a chord, especially for those of us who've seen the world change more times than we can count. It all began like any other late-night segment. Kimmel, smug as ever, cracking wise and keeping the crowd loose. Clint entered with that slow, deliberate presence we've come to expect from him. Even at 94, he carried himself like a man who still knew the weight of silence. The audience cheered, of course. You don't see a legend like that every day. But something in the air felt different. From the very first exchange, it was clear this wasn't going to be a lighthearted nostalgia trip. The jokes weren't landing. Kimmel, whether intentionally or not, crossed a line. A dig here, a smirk there. It wasn't long before the conversation veered into something deeper, sharper, and then Eastwood did something rare in today's world. He stood his ground, calmly, firmly, without fanfare or bluster. Have you ever watched someone draw a line? Not in anger, but in quiet disappointment? That's what made the moment powerful. It wasn't a shouting match. It wasn't theater. It was truth, delivered by a man who's seen more, done more, and endured more than most people on that studio lot will ever understand. Clint Eastwood reminded everyone, without raising his voice, that character still matters. That respect isn't earned by fame or ratings or clever punchlines, but by how you treat people, especially when the spotlight is on. And maybe, just maybe, that some of the values we're so quick to call outdated are exactly the ones we need most right now. You know, there's something about growing older that gives you a kind of clarity. You start to see past the noise, the gimmicks, the hollow applause. You've lived through enough to recognize the difference between someone trying to be funny and someone trying to be right at someone else's expense. And maybe that's why this moment hits so hard. Because we've all been there, haven't we? We've all watched someone get away with being smug, with mocking what they don't understand. And we've all wished that, just once, someone with the experience, the backbone, and the history would speak up. Not with venom, but with wisdom. That's what Clint Eastwood did. He wasn't just defending himself. He was defending the idea that doing real work, taking real risks, and caring deeply about something still counts for something. That creating, building, standing for something matters, especially when the easier choice is just to tear things down. And as he stood there, this silver-haired giant from another era, you could feel the audience shift, not in outrage, but in reflection, because Clint wasn't just speaking to Jimmy Kimmel. He was speaking to all of us. He was speaking to a culture that sometimes forgets where it came from, to an industry that often mistakes sarcasm for strength and popularity for principle. He was reminding everyone in that room and everyone watching from home that silence can be just as powerful as sound, and that dignity still has a place in public life. What unfolded on that stage wasn't just a generational clash, it was a wake-up call. And for those of us who remember when stars carried themselves with a certain grace, even when things got tough, it felt like a long overdue return to something real. So if you're curious about how it all unraveled, if you want to hear every sharp exchange, every heavy pause, every moment of quiet fire that changed the energy in that room, then settle in, because this isn't just a drama between two celebrities. It's a story about values, respect, and the rare courage to speak your mind when it matters most. Let's take a closer look at what really happened. On the night Clint Eastwood walked onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage and reminded everyone exactly who he is. What happens when Hollywood's most iconic tough guy sits across from late-night TV's King of Smug? Tonight, we're diving into a confrontation that had everyone talking when Clint Eastwood stepped onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage, and things quickly took a turn. This wasn't your average celebrity sit-down. It was a clash of two worlds. Authentic grit meets modern-day sarcasm. And the outcome? Well, let's just say it didn't go down quiet. Before we jump in, don't forget to hit that Subscribe button and let us know what you think in the comments, because this story only gets juicier. The evening started like most others on Jimmy Kimmel Live. Bright lights, buzzing crowd, and that familiar mix of energy and anticipation. Then in walked Clint Eastwood. At 94 years old, the man still held the room like a gunslinger walking into a dusty saloon. The audience gave him a standing ovation, genuinely thrilled to see one of Hollywood's living legends. But something was off. Maybe it was Kimmel's smile. It felt more forced than friendly. Or maybe it was his monologue earlier that night, already poking fun at some of Hollywood's elder statesmen. There was a tone, subtle but sharp. Eastwood settled into the guest chair with his signature, slow, deliberate style. Every movement seemed purposeful, as if he had all the time in the world. He straightened his jacket, looked Kimmel square in the eyes, and gave a single nod. The kind of nod that said, "I'm ready." "Clint Eastwood, everybody," Kimmel announced, his voice bouncing with that sing-song rhythm that makes even a compliment feel like a punchline. "Thanks for being here. I have to say, you look great for your age." The crowd chuckled. Eastwood didn't. "Well," Clint replied dryly, "I'm still breathing. That counts for something." Kimmel couldn't help himself. "That's more than we can say for some of your characters," he quipped, clearly amused. Then, without missing a beat, he added, "Speaking of which, you've been pretty quiet lately when it comes to politics. Not like the old days back when you were talking to empty chairs." Now, if you remember that moment from the Republican National Convention years ago, you know exactly what Kimmel was referencing. But in that room, the joke landed like a sack of bricks. The audience shifted, unsure whether to laugh or wince. Eastwood leaned back, just slightly. His eyes narrowed, just enough to say, "Game on." "I figured I'd leave the empty chair talking to the professionals," he replied, voice gravelly and calm. "Though I see you've got the solo act down to an art." A few chuckles broke through the tension, but Kimmel's smile was starting to strain. Still, he pushed forward. "That's what they pay me for," he said with a shrug. "But seriously, don't you think it's time your generation stepped aside and let some younger voices take over? I mean, Hollywood's changing. Maybe it's time some of those old-school attitudes changed with it." Eastwood didn't flinch. Not a blink, not a twitch. Just the kind of steady silence that makes you lean in a little closer, because you know what's coming isn't going to be polite. This wasn't just an actor taking offense. This was a veteran, a legend, calmly sizing up his opponent. Clint Eastwood wasn't reacting emotionally. He was calculating, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "You know, Jimmy," Eastwood began, his voice dropping to a quiet, gravelly tone that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "I've been making movies since before you were even born. I've worked with everyone, from Sergio Leone to Meryl Streep. I've directed films that won Oscars. I've made pictures folks still quote 40 years later. So when you suggest I should step aside, I have to wonder, what exactly have you done that makes you qualified to say that?" You could hear a pin drop in that studio. The energy had completely shifted. This wasn't the playful back and forth people had expected. It was something else entirely. A reckoning. Kimmel's face turned a shade redder. Still, he tried to hold his ground. "Well, I've got a pretty successful talk show," he offered, clearly rattled. "We've won a few awards. We've got millions of viewers." "Congratulations," Eastwood said, the word practically dripping with sarcasm. "You've mastered the art of reading jokes that someone else wrote while chatting with people more talented than yourself. That's quite the legacy." Now, the tension was thick. You could practically feel the anxiety behind the cameras. Kimmel's producers were probably sweating bullets, hoping things would cool off. But instead of backing down, Jimmy doubled down. His ego had taken a hit, and it showed. "You know what, Clint?" he snapped. "Maybe this whole attitude is the problem. The tough guy, I'm better than everyone persona. It's kind of outdated, don't you think? Times have changed. People want something real now. They want authenticity, not some cowboy act from the 1970s. Eastwood didn't blink. His jaw tightened. Just a touch. But you could tell the remark landed. "Cowboy act?" he repeated slowly, each word sharper than the last. "Son, I've been shot at. Real bullets, not Twitter posts or bad reviews. I've worked 16-hour days in 100-degree heat. I've made movies that meant something. I've hired thousands of people, launched careers, and told stories that lasted. He leaned in just a bit. You sit behind a desk, he continued, his voice now dangerously calm, making jokes at the expense of people who actually do the work. And you want to talk to me about authenticity? Kimmel looked like he'd been hit by a truck. His usual quick-witted comebacks were nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, the audience looked on in stunned silence, like rubberneckers passing a car crash. They couldn't look away, but they weren't exactly comfortable with what they were seeing either. Trying to recover, Kimmel reached for a broader point. Look, he said, all I'm saying is maybe some of the old guard in Hollywood need to admit that things are different now. The industry's changed, and maybe it's time some of those attitudes change too. We can't keep celebrating that same old masculine toxicity. Eastwood cut him off. Masculine toxicity? He echoed, his voice still low but now with an unmistakable edge, sharp enough to slice through steel. Is that what you call it when a man puts in a hard day's work? When he owns up to his choices? When he doesn't need to tear other people down to feel good about himself? There it was, a simple, cold statement, and it hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence felt like it lasted a lifetime. And Kimmel? He looked like he was struggling to find a way out. Kimmel was clearly trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but Clint Eastwood wasn't ready to let up just yet. You want to talk about evolution, Jimmy? He said, that voice steady and low. Let's really talk about how entertainment has changed. It used to be, if you were in this business, you had to have real talent. You had to sing, dance, act, or tell a story that actually meant something. He leaned in a little closer. Now, you can build a whole career off reading tweets out loud and making faces at a camera. That's not evolution. That's devolution. Kimmel's face had gone from pink to crimson. The man who built his brand on snarky comebacks and having the last word was, for once, at a loss. He wasn't used to someone who didn't follow the usual rules of late-night banter, and instead of backing down, he made the mistake that would haunt the rest of the interview. You know what, Clint? He said, trying to regain the upper hand. I think you're just bitter that Hollywood moved on without you. I mean, when's the last time you made a movie anyone under 30 even watched? Maybe instead of lecturing me about talent, you should work on staying relevant in an industry that's clearly passed you by. It was a swing, and a hard one. The kind meant to hurt, and the audience felt it. You could almost hear everyone behind the camera stop breathing for a moment. Even the studio lights seemed to dim, but Eastwood didn't flinch. He just locked eyes with Kimmel, those pale blue eyes, sharp and cold as steel, doing all the talking for a long, heavy second. Then finally he leaned forward and spoke so softly, the room had to go completely still just to catch it. Passed me by, he repeated. Jimmy, my last film made over $200 million worldwide. It was nominated for 6 Academy Awards. He paused. But here's what's really interesting. Your show, this show, averages about 2 million viewers on a good night. He let that settle for a beat. My movies, the ones you think nobody watches, they're still in theaters. They're on streaming platforms across the globe. People are still discovering them, still talking about them. Now you tell me, how many of your jokes from last week do you think anyone remembers? Kimmel opened his mouth to reply, but Eastwood raised one finger. And somehow that one small gesture froze the host in place. I'm not done, Eastwood said calmly. You want to talk about relevance? I've been making films for over 50 years. I've survived every trend, every wave of change in this industry, every shift in public taste. And do you know why? Because I never chased what was trendy. I made what mattered. He wasn't gloating. He was just stating facts, and the audience could feel it. You, he continued, looking directly at Kimmel, you're a product, built by focus groups and network executives. You say what they tell you to say. You think what they want you to think. So when you start talking about authenticity, he gave a small shake of the head. It's like a puppet trying to lecture a craftsman on the value of hard work. The room was completely still. No laughter, no applause. Just that weighty silence that settles in when someone tells a truth that cuts too deep. Kimmel was visibly shaken now. His usual quick-fire confidence had cracked, but pride kept him from backing down completely. "All right, that's a nice speech," he said, trying to regain his footing. "But let's be honest. Your era, it came with some real problems. The way women were treated, the lack of diversity, the whole boys club mentality. Maybe some of those things should have been left behind." Eastwood's face shifted, no longer just stern but deeply personal. This wasn't about showbiz anymore. This was about values. "Boys club?" he repeated, and his voice dropped to that quiet, razor-sharp tone again. The kind that doesn't need volume to command a room. "Jimmy, I've worked with and for some of the strongest women in this industry. I've directed actresses who went on to get Oscar nominations. I've produced films with female leads when studios wouldn't even touch them. I've hired women in every part of my crew. Cinematographers, editors, producers." He leaned in slightly, never raising his voice but cutting deeper with every word. "So tell me, what have you done for women in entertainment, besides crack jokes about their looks and treat them like set dressing on your show?" Kimmel's mouth opened, then closed. He looked like a fish out of water, gasping for a comeback but finding none. He hadn't expected Clint to turn that accusation around so effortlessly, or with such precision. "And since we're on the subject," Eastwood continued, his voice growing a bit stronger, "let's talk about diversity. I was casting people of color in major roles when your biggest concern was whether you get picked for dodgeball. I've told stories about folks from every walk of life. Veterans, immigrants, single parents, blue-collar workers. And you?" He paused for a breath. "You sit behind a desk, mocking people who look different, who talk different, who think different. And then you call that progress?" The studio was completely still. Not a whisper, not a shuffle. Even the assistants had stopped moving. It felt like everyone was holding their breath. Kimmel looked like he was hunting for the nearest exit, but Eastwood wasn't letting up. "You know what your real problem is, Jimmy?" Clint said, leaning forward again. "You've never created anything that wasn't spoon-fed to you by a team of writers and network execs. You've never taken a real risk, never stood behind a project you believed in when the money or the critics weren't on your side." Eastwood's gaze didn't waver. "You're a middleman in an industry built by people who actually had something to say. So when you sit there and try to lecture me about being outdated, it's like hearing a karaoke singer tell Sinatra how to sing." The audience was stunned. You could feel the discomfort in the room, some folks shifting in their seats, unsure of where this was all headed. Kimmel finally found his voice, though it came out thinner, shakier than usual. "Hey, that's not fair," he said, trying to sound firm. "I work hard. I put in long hours. I care about this show." Clint gave a half smile, but it wasn't warm. "Hard work?" he repeated, almost amused. "Son, hard work is getting up at 4 a.m. to catch the perfect light for a scene. It's doing take after take when your body's screaming at you to stop. It's being responsible for hundreds of people who depend on you to make something worth their time and effort." He let that sit for a second, then added with a pointed calm, "You read cue cards and react to applause signs. That's not hard work, Jimmy. That's advanced babysitting." Now a few murmurs rippled through the audience. Some folks were starting to squirm in their seats. This had long since stopped being just a celebrity chat. Kimmel's producers were probably shouting into his earpiece, but the host looked frozen, completely unable to steer the show back under control. "You want to know what's really outdated?" Eastwood said, one last time. "It's this idea that tearing people down makes you look smarter, that being cynical is the same thing as being insightful, that just because you can point out what's wrong with something, you automatically know how to make it better." He looked around the room, his voice steady. "That's not wisdom. That's just intellectual laziness, dressed up as sophistication." Kimmel, clearly scrambling now, tried one more last-ditch effort to reclaim some control. Okay, he started. Okay, Kimmel stammered. "Let's just calm down. This is supposed to be fun, right? Entertainment. People tune in to laugh, not to watch some angry old man rant about the good old days." And there it was. Those 3 words, "angry old man," landed like a slap across the face. Eastwood's jaw clenched. You could almost feel the temperature in the studio drop a few degrees. Angry old man, Clint repeated slowly, his voice now carrying that steel-edged authority that made Dirty Harry so iconic. No, Jimmy, I'm not angry. Angry is when someone cuts you off in traffic. What you're hearing now? This is something different. He paused, letting the silence sharpen the moment. This is disappointment. And with that, Eastwood didn't just push back. He delivered a quiet gut punch. Disappointment that someone with your reach, your platform, this opportunity to actually contribute something meaningful to the culture, uses it instead to be a professional wisecracker. You could use this show to celebrate real achievement, to spotlight people doing important work, to bring something positive into the world. He looked Kimmel right in the eye. But instead, you mock, you diminish, you tear down. That's not entertainment, Jimmy. That's just sad. That last word, sad, hung in the air like a final judgment. And for a moment, Kimmel just sat there, pale now, all the color drained from his face. You could see the moment his discomfort twisted into something else. Defensiveness. His voice, when it came, was sharp and brittle, like a teenager caught mouthing off and doubling down instead of backing down. You know what's sad, Clint? Kimmel snapped. Watching someone who used to be relevant try to lecture the rest of us about how things should be. Maybe if you spent less time clinging to the past and more time understanding how the world actually works now, you'd see your whole tough guy routine for what it is. Just toxic masculinity in a cowboy hat. The room went completely silent. Even the hum of the studio lights seemed to vanish. Eastwood didn't move. He just sat there, eyes fixed on Kimmel, unblinking. Then slowly he stood up. Deliberate, unhurried, but with absolute purpose. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Stand up, Jimmy. The words were barely louder than a whisper, but they landed with the weight of thunder. Kimmel blinked, confused. What? I said, stand up. Eastwood repeated, this time a little firmer. If you're going to talk to me like that, you're going to do it on your feet, like a man. The audience was completely still now. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something raw, something real. Kimmel looked around the studio, searching for a way out. Cameras, audience, producers, someone to pull the plug. But no one moved. Clint, maybe we should just stand up, Eastwood said again, this time with unmistakable finality. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Kimmel hesitated, then slowly rose from his chair, and suddenly the difference between them was stark. Despite being in his 90s, Eastwood still carried himself like a man who had faced down storms and never flinched. Kimmel, for all his showbiz confidence, looked like what he was, a talk show host who had never stared down anything quite this real. You want to talk about toxic masculinity? Eastwood said, stepping forward, closing the distance to Kimmel's desk. You want to know what's really toxic, Jimmy? Eastwood said, stepping closer, his voice calm, but with that unmistakable edge. Toxic is a man who makes his living by tearing down people better than himself. Toxic is hiding behind sarcasm and jokes because you don't have the guts to stand up for anything real. Kimmel looked like he wanted to interrupt, but Clint raised his hand. And just like before, that single gesture stopped him cold. It was firm, authoritative, and absolute. I'm not finished. His voice stayed measured, but each word hit with the weight of conviction. You sit behind that desk night after night, mocking people who actually do things. Athletes, actors, politicians, entrepreneurs, anyone who dares to put themselves out there and try something meaningful. Clint shook his head slowly. You don't just mock their failures. You belittle their successes, and you do it all with that smug little grin, like you're somehow above it all. But here's the truth, Jimmy. You've never risked anything. You've never stood for something that cost you. You've never failed at something that mattered. The studio was so silent, you could hear people breathing. The usual buzz of late-night energy was gone. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was something much deeper and far more raw. Kimmel, normally so quick with a snarky reply, looked stunned, eyes darting, still searching for a way out. Eastwood wasn't done. You want to know what real masculinity looks like? He asked, voice rising just slightly. It's not about being tough. It's about taking responsibility. It's treating people with respect, even when you disagree. It's about building something worthwhile instead of just tearing things down. He let that sit for a beat, then added, "It's admitting when you're wrong, learning from it, standing up for folks who can't stand up for themselves, not turning them into the punchline of your next monologue." Finally, Kimmel found his voice, but it was a shaky whisper. "This is my show, Clint. You can't just what?" Eastwood snapped back, cutting him off. "Speak the truth? Call out a bully for what he is?" His tone cooled again, deadly quiet. "You're right. This is your show. And that means everything that happens here, that's on you. Every joke that lands too hard, every cheap shot at someone who's not here to defend themselves. Every time you pick mockery over meaning, that's your choice. That's your responsibility." The murmuring started again in the audience, but this time, it wasn't the easy laughter or encouragement Kimmel usually got. It was different. People were shifting in their seats, uncomfortable, like they were watching something far more personal than they had signed up for. "You know what the saddest part is?" Eastwood said, dropping his voice to that gravelly whisper again. "You had potential, Jimmy." He shook his head, almost as if he wished it weren't true. "I remember watching you when you were hungry, when you cared, when you actually wanted to be good at this, not just famous for it. But somewhere along the line, you stopped reaching for meaning and settled for being clever." He paused, his words landing like slow, heavy footsteps. "You chose the easy route, cynicism over sincerity, safe laughs over real impact. And that's not on my generation, Jimmy. That's on you." Kimmel now looked like he was barely holding it together. The polished performer was gone. What remained was just a man under fire. "Look," he said, voice cracking, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we just—" He glanced around helplessly. "Why don't we just pretend this didn't happen?" Eastwood finished the sentence for him. "Why don't we just smile, shake hands, and pretend everything's fine? That what you want, Jimmy?" He didn't wait for an answer, because that fake, polished, superficial act is exactly what's wrong with this business. Everyone's too scared for a real conversation, too scared of real conflict, too scared of facing actual consequences. He stepped closer, now standing right at the edge of Kimmel's desk. The host instinctively backed away, just a small step, but noticeable. "Here's the thing about consequences, Jimmy," Eastwood said quietly. "They don't care about your excuses, or your justifications, or your ratings. They just are." He straightened up, squared his shoulders. "And when you build a career on cutting people down, eventually someone's going to stand up and push back. Tonight, that someone is me." The room was dead quiet. No applause, no laughter, just that heavy, breath-held silence. Then Eastwood turned toward the main camera, directly addressing the audience with that calm, steady voice that had captivated generations. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I came here tonight to talk about my work, to share some stories, maybe get a laugh or two. But instead, I found myself on the receiving end of something that's become all too common. Disrespect masquerading as entertainment." He paused just long enough to let it land. "I've said what I needed to say, not just to Mr. Kimmel here, but to anyone who thinks cruelty is the same thing as cleverness. It's not. And I won't sit here and play along like it is." Then he turned back to Kimmel one last time. "You know, Jimmy, you might want to revisit those old westerns you like to make fun of, because in those stories, the good guys stood for something. They protected the vulnerable. They built communities. They had a thing we used to call character." Clint gave a final nod. "Maybe try that sometime." And with that, Clint Eastwood turned and walked off the stage, leaving Jimmy Kimmel standing behind his desk, alone, looking not like a host, but like a man who had just come face to face with the truth about himself and didn't like what he saw. The audience sat in stunned silence, some unsure whether to clap, others just staring. The cameras kept rolling, but there was nothing left to capture except the echoes of a moment that felt inevitable, a reckoning long overdue. That's the story of what happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy meets late-night TV's most arrogant host. What do you think? Was Eastwood right to call Kimmel out like that? Or did he take it too far? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, be sure to subscribe. There's plenty more where that came from.